Tēnā tātou katoa, ko Wendy aho, and we're thrilled to be here with you today for this session with Christina Thornley from the Teaching Council. Christina's here to talk about learning support coordinators and two changes that you'll be thinking about. The first is that shift you're making in your new LSC role from working directly with Tamariki to thinking about how you work effectively one layer out, supporting the adults that are supporting the Tamariki. This really aligns well with some shifts in the Teaching Council and how they've moved to the growth cycle, where you work backwards from your practice to identify that evidence of quality practice in maintaining your own growth and the growth of your context. Let me start with a karakia and then we'll introduce Christina. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana. He huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. Christina, warm welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself and a bit about your role, and then we'll get started?
Kia ora, thank you, Wendy. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko takatimu te paimoanga, ko aparima te awa, ko ototo te takiwā, e noho ho ki te whanganui atara, ko Chris Thornley tāko ingoa, kei te mahi o I te matatu Aotearoa. In my role at Matatu, I've worked with the code and standards, Ngā Tikanga Matatika, Ngā Paerewa, and now the professional growth cycle. And I have lots of opportunities to be able to talk and learn with teachers as they've been implementing these initiatives or processes. So it was a thrill for me to be able to be involved in the work with the learning support coordinators, the work that we undertook with the Ministry of Education and a group of learning support coordinators to see how you can all maintain your full practicing certificate, which is now called Tūturu Category 1 Full. I'm very pleased to have you here today, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity. Ki te mihi mahana kia koutou katoa.
Thank you, Chris.
So our code, our standards, Ngā Tikanga Matatika, Ngā Paerewa. So in late 2020, the Teaching Council worked with the Ministry of Education and a group of learning support coordinators to understand how teachers or kaiako working in these roles could maintain that full Tūturu Category 1 practicing certificate. It needed to be ascertained that within the role, any learning support coordinator would be able to use and meet the standards for the teaching profession, or Ngā Paerewa mō te umanga whakaakuranga in English and Māori medium respectively. So the Council began by analysing the role description of learning support coordinators in relation to the standards and the Paerewa. It was necessary for us to be able to see that the role description included the actions, the knowledge, and the professional attributes and values of the standards or Paerewa. So a matching up task was undertaken to be sure that each of the 6 standards were visible for those working in English medium, and that the 6 Paerewa were visible for those working in Māori medium. So an important outcome for learning support coordinators and their employing principals or tumuaki is that the matching up task illustrated an alignment showing that anyone successfully working in the role, be it in English medium or Māori medium, could maintain a Tūturu Full Category 1 practicing certificate.
This is so reassuring for those of us who are out there doing the mahi and just wanting to make sure, especially things that are less tangible like values, that we're able to demonstrate those in real ways for you and for our contexts.
That's great, Wendy. And I think part of that is passing that work to the learning support coordinators and their principals and tumuaki to actually take that further. In Aotearoa, we have just that one single set of standards or Paerewa for all positional leaders and teachers. So that means that the same ones apply irrespective of where they're teaching, the age of their learners, the priorities of the school, kura, and the communities that they serve. This is a really great reflection of how the profession is trusted to use nationally available frameworks and policies to help them to actually contextualise the standards to their own place. The outcome of this process has often been recorded on the Council's Quality Practice template resource, but other recording formats can be used. It's such an important piece of work that it's now part of element A in the professional growth cycle. So when you look at the elements for the professional growth cycle, you'll see that this interpretation of the standards or paerewa for each context is kind of the starting place.
So Chris, as using the old system, I know a lot of people start sort of from left to right and they think about the standards and then they think about the elaborations, and there's sort of, it gets bitsier and bitsier as they try to figure out how they'll meet each of those. And sometimes it seems like an awful lot of evidence. And that's the main shift, isn't it? Is that now you're saying these are so integrated, these 6 paerewa, these 6 standards. And if you're doing the work out there, we can affirm for you that you'll be able to demonstrate that. Working kind of from right to left now.
I think that's a really good point. Yes, the evidence is not something that you're going to be collecting or gathering or filing anywhere. It's acknowledging that there's always evidence in the decisions that we make about teaching. The evidence is rich within those decisions, within the natural practice, and we use it for thinking about what we're going to do next. But also, I think you raise a really good point that people felt that you have to look at the standard and then you have to look at every elaboration and say, what do each of those elaborations look like in your practice? The elaborations were just put there because when people said we want fewer standards than we had with the practice and teacher criteria, we were able to go from 12 to 6. But people also, and when I say people, I mean teachers and those in positional roles, said, we want a bit of a hint around what this could look like. So that's why the elaborations are there, to sort of give you an idea of how you create those indicators for yourselves.
I think it's such a nice shift, because I know a lot of people would then think we'd get stuck on, does this fit under Tatinity? Does this fit under, and we'd start getting stuck on, does it fit in relationships? Is it this elaboration? Is that elaboration? And you're making this really coherent, holistic framework now that we can actually align what we're doing with what the rest of the kura, the school is doing, and then work backwards to say, well, actually it meets all of these now.
Yeah, and that's precisely it. And in the resources that we've got around supporting people to get into that professional growth cycle, we talk about this move to a holistic understanding of practice, practice outcome standards, paerewa, thinking about it in that kind of way. So yeah, much more like real teaching practice.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the other things that I want to mention is that there will be a significant difference for people who are in those learning support coordinator roles. And I think everyone's aware of this. The difference really lies in the fact that your learners are often not your students. And as Wendy said before, you might not be teaching in a classroom so much. Your learners are often your teacher colleagues. And this means that you meet and use the standards as they work or as you work and teach adults. Now that also occurs for other roles, particularly principals, tūmoaki, RTLB, and teachers in initial teacher education. It does have implications for how you actually create the learning focused culture. You'll do that differently than you might have done when you were teaching in a classroom context. Similarly, the way in which you design the learning will look different, and the ways in which you teach. So as a learning support coordinator, you'll need to think about how these look within and also inform your roles. And being conscious of the standards in your roles will become a natural part of the professional growth cycle too, where the elements emphasize not only meeting the standards, but using them. So as you're talking about them, as you're saying, what do these look like in our place, you'll be using them to think about the quality of the work that you're doing and how you can enhance it.
Chris, one of the things that's always on top for me working one layer out is Well, a couple of things actually. I guess the first one is one layer out, it's really hard to show outcomes that are directly related to what I've done. And then I guess the flip side of that is we're working on these really collaborative teams. And I always have a hard time saying, well, what's the Wendy bit in there? Because actually it should be invisible. It should just be the whole team leading to outcomes for the kids. So how can I reassure myself around those couple of things in the new framework?
I think that's where doing that work around interpreting the standards for your context or the pairewha for your context really helps.
Mhm.
That can be giving you the reassurance. You're looking at it saying, well, these are the things that we said matter in our place.
Mhm.
I'm doing those things. And I think a big contribution and the part that we need to be learning and thinking about is actually how we impact on our colleagues. Because when we're working in a much more collegial way, the relationships that we have with our colleagues will really matter. So a lot of this is around how we interact in those conversations, but also in our own personal thinking, the kind of deep reflection that we undertake, that we then allow us to have sort of new knowledge that we bring to conversations. So I think we think about it differently, and we're not trying to actually prove a causal sort of chain right through to say, well, I did this and that meant this happened. And so that changed the teacher's practice, which then played on to have this happen for our learners. You can't directly say that you necessarily made that difference always. However, it is important to be thinking about what the difference is that you want to make. Because when you're thinking about designing the learning or planning the kind of learning focused culture, how you're going to create that, you need to keep in your mind what you want this to feel like for colleagues, for teachers, and for the students or the young people or children with whom you're indirectly working.
But the intention is as important as the impact. The process is as important as the product.
Yeah, actually, that's a great way of saying it. Thank you. That's exactly it. Yeah. And just feeling confident to know that you are doing what you need to be doing and that you're learning, and learning is part of your role.
Thank you.
Okay. So we've talked quite a bit about using the standards in the pairewha. And now I just want to talk about the sort of supporting information that we've got. And you'll see that there are some links here, and I'll tell you a little bit about why the links lead to the things that they do. So this is information, obviously, for learning support coordinators and for employing principals in Tumuaki. So for those in English medium settings, the alignment between the standards with their elaborations and the role description has now been presented actually in a matrix, and that's available on the council website. We've also worked a little further with that to give some examples of what quality practices could look like. And some of those were provided by learning support coordinators as suggestions, and kindly they've allowed us to include those in the resource. They show the contextual interpretation of the standards in the work that's different across learning support coordinator settings. These are indicative and not compulsory. For the learning support coordinators in Māori medium settings, the pairewha and the role description are aligned, but they have not yet been developed into a matrix. So similarly, examples of contextual interpretation have not yet been developed. So learning support coordinators from Māori medium contexts said that they would actually like a longer time frame to be clear about how the role description and the pairewha and their work all fit together. So for that reason, the council just requests that learning support coordinators in Māori medium contexts and their employing Tumuaki use the pairewha and reference to the elaborations. So they're in this document, and you'll see on the screen there the appropriate pages. And again, it's not intended that you would be demonstrating every one of those elaborations exactly as it's written, but that you would be using that as the starting point for this thinking. So it's indicative of how the learning support coordinators demonstrate the pairewha. So as with the English medium quality practice examples, It's not expected that every elaboration or interpretation would be visible. These are indicative and really wanting to be representative of the kinds of practice that you will be using that reflect the standards or paerewa.
Mm. I know last year when I talked to you once, you said you'd done like 65 webinars, or it was some amazing amount of co-design and consultation. It's just so nice to see the genuine examples of people out there grappling with the same things. How much is enough? How do I evidence it in the best ways? How do I equally focus on Maori medium as English medium? It's just so nice to see what you've done. And just to let everyone watching know, we'll give you all these resources below. So this is kind of the first half hour of your journey into these, but please do spend some time unpacking all these resources on your site, or also just hearing the stories of people that are on the journey as well.
And I guess, thanks, Wendy. There's another thing that's important to say here. When we were talking with the learning support coordinators around this work, it became really clear to me, and I guess I knew anyway, but it was lovely to hear it kind of re-emphasized, that there's a national consistency around the practice and what's kind of expected, but there is a wonderful uniqueness and diversity within that. And so that kind of plays out in the standards or the paerewa, that yes, we have to have a consistency. We need to know what's kind of going on across the country, that it kind of sits to a similar level, but that it's appropriate, and then it's actually contextualized, and the role and the way in which people undertake the role, the way in which they describe their practices will look different in those different contexts. Yeah. And that's the bit that's been great for me to learn and see as we've worked with teachers all around the place on Zooms, and in some cases face-to-face.
Agreed. There's always that tension between nationally consistent and locally responsive. And what that requires in the middle is the high trust. And that's what comes through in the new standards and the new growth cycle, I think.
So I just want to go sort of briefly through some steps here. These steps kind of emulate the elements of the professional growth cycle, but of course the professional growth cycle calls it out more specifically. And as Wendy said, she's going to give you links to the work on the council website around that. One of the things that matters is the growth cycle is high trust. It does really emphasize the complexity of practice, the importance of working within your own context. And so these resources will give you a bit more detail around it. But for the purpose of this conversation here, I just want to call out these kind of steps. So that first element of the growth cycle is about employing school or kura principals or tumuaki and the learning support coordinators having a common understanding of what the standards or the paerewa and what meeting them as learning support coordinators in their context looks like. Now, I think we have to be really clear here that this will be an evolving understanding. And it is, I think, in all roles. You're not going to immediately know exactly how it should look. And that's kind of the purpose for doing this in an evidence-based way, as you find that some of the things that you thought would work really well may not work as well as you thought. So you change them, evolve them. But what matters is that everyone's kind of clear about what it means to be meeting and using the standards. And so that's the first element. And I've kind of called it out here as the first step. The second part, or element B, refers to the design of the professional growth cycle. And all of the elements do actually start by saying the principal or the tumuaki with the teacher will do that, undertake that design. Now, there will also be support for the teacher to participate in that growth cycle. And I think how you will do that yourself will probably require you to bring a bit more to it, because you are kind of the people who understand your role really well and the kind of individual nature of what you're doing. But this is really directly driving at the fact that there will be planning and a kind of collaboration around what your growth cycle would look like. And then elements C and D in the professional growth cycle really talk about how this will all work to support learning, and that kind of learning focus, bringing the standards in, and also the understanding the relationship between practice and outcomes for learners. So I've kind of simplified that here to just be saying, as part of the professional growth cycle, the learning support coordinators will have the opportunity to learn, grow, discuss their practice, and receive feedback. And that's in relation to what they're doing and what's happening to their learners or for their learners to deepen the understanding. And then finally, this is the endorsement piece, that annually the employing school or kura principal or tumuaki will confirm whether or not the learning support coordinator meets the standards or parewa. Now, we've always said that this would be an annual process, even within a 3-year practicing certificate renewal, because it's very reassuring and important for teachers to know annually that they've met those standards, and for us to know that, and to have a document that just simply says that they've met the standards. And the second piece to it is participated in a growth cycle, because then if they have a new employing school principal or they change roles, they've got the document from over the 3 different years to be able to say, yes, this was what I was doing. This person has endorsed that I met the standards. So it's not a big official kind of document, it's just a statement, and it does the 2 pieces. Yes, that I meet the standards or parewa, and yes, I participated in a professional growth cycle.
And what that means, is it fair to say that I don't need to give you my shiniest practice where everything went to plan and everything was perfect, that you actually want to see the iterative over time, you want to see the growth, you want to see the ways I worked with others and fit within the wider growth cycle of my kura or my school. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's really exactly it. And when we say see it, we're not envisaging those big folders like people previously had. It is quite possible that entering into conversations, you'll want to collate some things or have them readily accessible on your computer, because you want that conversation to be evidence-based. It's so important to be able to maximize the benefits that can come out of these learning conversations, and to be able to talk about that everyday practice. And so making it evidence-based, evidence that's going to help you to understand more about the teaching and learning that occurs in the role. And as you say, in a kind of everyday way. That's what matters.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
So further resources. We've just got a list here of some resources that relate to this topic and can be found on the Teaching Council website. So there is the Learning Support Coordinator resource. Quite a lot of that material at the moment reflects the work that we have done in English medium, and it will still be done in Māori medium, but it's quite easy to see how you can put ngā paerewa into here and be thinking about a process that's very similar. And certainly, as I said, by using the paerewa and their elaborations, you can be perfectly clear as a tumuaki or as a learning support coordinator in a Māori medium setting that you're demonstrating those in your practice and participating in that professional growth cycle, because that is for everyone. The second thing is the professional growth cycle webinar. And that's just an overview pre-recorded webinar done between with me and a colleague, speaking to the growth cycle, and sitting alongside it, there are some resources of the kinds of things that people were saying in our live webinars, so that people could get a feel for what it might look like. The other document is the endorser guideline, and this is a new piece that was put together following the professional growth cycle development work, because it was apparent that endorsement processes were not always fully understood by principals, tumuaki, teachers, kākau, and that the council could do a better job there. So we've put together a document that you can go to. It's an interpretation, if you like, of the policy, and it just calls out the really saline, important pieces, salient, not saline, important pieces that relate to this, and it's an easy to read version. And finally, what I want to say is please always feel that you can contact us. I love talking with teachers or professional leaders or principals, tūmoaki, kaiako, about the work that they're doing. It builds our understanding. And as Wendy said at the beginning, the professional growth cycle is a new piece of work for us. We're not creating models saying this is what it should look like. We're putting the trust in our profession, and we're facilitating opportunities to talk and learn and think about it. And us having an opportunity to get feedback from people really, really matters. Similarly, being able to answer your questions really matters to us. So please feel free to send comments or feedback or questions, particularly in relation to your role as a learning support coordinator. Perhaps I should just say one other thing here that's popped to the top of my mind. When it comes to the time to renew your practicing certificate using Hapori Matatu, there's a set of steps that can be followed by learning support coordinators and principals, tūmoaki, and they're called out at the end of that resource, the learning support coordinator resource. When I say the end of the kind of front 2 pages that give information, and they just tell you what to choose in some of the drop-down menus. Because, for example, the learning support coordinator role isn't one of the options. Instead, you would choose the teacher option. We've created those steps and we've trialed them, and we've heard that they work really well. But sometimes just being able to find a little piece of information like that can make a task so much easier.
Thank you. And can I just tautoko what you said about your open door policy, your open Zoom policy? Honestly, you're amazing at just being so open to hearing questions, but also if people have examples from the field. And if there's things you want to come back in 6 months and tell us about, we'd love to have you back. So we have an open Zoom policy for you too, Chris.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Wendy. And I think I should say here that the next piece of work that we're very close to releasing final details on is the professional growth cycle for principals and tūmoaki. Mm-hmm. So we will be running some Zooms around those, but the development in that space has been taken quite a long time, because we really understood it was a complex space, that there were a lot of people to talk to and listen to and learn from. And so that's the process we've been undertaking. And it's also going to have quite a long implementation phase, so that people aren't going to suddenly look at, oh, these are the elements, do we have to do that right at the start of the year? But actually we'll be able to come on board more at a time that suits them. So for those of you who are listening to this, if that information hasn't been put out yet, it will come out very, very soon. And we'll be running Zooms around those and continue on with Zooms that now kind of facilitate conversation more between teachers around the professional growth cycle, rather than being so much a presentation style, such as I've done today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. One thing we're so passionate about in the Learning Support Network, and I know you will be too, is this idea of job crafting, that there's elements of our job that all of us need to do and need to be consistent across every LSC. And then there's always a bit of space to make it your own. So bring your own strengths, interests, and really be free to align what you do with what your context needs. And that's uncharted territory in a way for the principals who are saying, I need to affirm that this is good practice, and for each of us to know we're on the right track. But I think everything you've provided here, especially, and just the whole journey, it's really supporting that idea of how do we bring ourselves to our work in really contextualized and unique ways. So thank you so much. And we'd love to be part of more of those informal chats around how it looks up and down the motu.
Wow.
Is there anything else? Oh, you want to say one more thing before we close, don't you, Chris?
I do. I wanted to acknowledge all the learning support coordinators who participated in the conversations with us to support us in a way forward for certification. So thank you for that work. for the testing of ideas and the thinking that you've done, for the providing of feedback with some examples, but also for helping us to understand the complexity of the roles that you undertake. It was a privilege for us to work with you, and I know I can speak about this from the point of view of my colleague, Arnie Rolleston, who also worked in these conversations. So thank you. And thank you too to the Ministry of Education, who facilitated the engagement, provided the guidance, and helped us to advance the work together. It was a very, very enjoyable piece of work to be involved in. And thank you, Wendy, for supporting this work today, and your colleagues at Massey. We appreciate it.
It's been a privilege to kind of be part of the three-legged stool with the Teaching Council and the Learning Support Coordinators and the ministry. So thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate your time and just doing it in this format so we could get it out to as many LSC as possible and then have forum conversations and resources to continue the Kōrero. I will just close with a karakia. Tuamutu a mato mahi mo tene wā. Manakitia mai mato katoa. O mato hoa, o mato whānau. Aio ki te aorangi. Thank you, Chris. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe.
Kia ora.